Hey everybody, it's been another build for this week, and this time it was a more simpler budget-based build. Let me show you the parts. Let me show you the price. In the title, the price might be a little bit misleading when you first read it. I want to make sure you understand when I say price, what is all included in that. But let me explain the build first. So the build, this is the Cooler Master NR600 case. The case is about $70. We included some of these RGB fans, these ones down here, and the fans cost about $37 for 3 with these LED strips, which I think is a killer deal. They run at 1500 RPM. We went with the stock cooler of the Ryzen 3 3100, a 4-core, 8-thread CPU that runs games very well. If you are gaming and doing simple things on the side, even if you're streaming, if you have the right card and you can stream, you can actually run very well with a 4-core 8-thread CPU. Of course, getting a higher-end CPU such as the Ryzen 5 to the Ryzen 7, you're going to get great performance. But for this build, the Ryzen 3 3100 and the 1650 Super, it worked out very, very good for a budget-based build. Really good performance, about 90 or so FPS on high settings in Call of Duty Modern Warfare at 1080p. The motherboard I used is the B550M motherboard. The 550 chipset will support the Zen 3 Ryzen chips going forward. So it's a really good motherboard to get if you intend to upgrade your GPU to the PCIe Gen 4 graphics, for instance, or to the next generation of the Ryzen chips. It's just a solid board to do that. Now, the wattage is actually a 650 80 plus bronze power supply. I actually really like this power supply. It actually comes with 2 8-pin connectors for the motherboard if you actually have a motherboard that needs 2 8-pin connectors, which is really neat. So that's the build. I obviously used a M.2 500GB SSD, 16 gigabytes of 3200 RAM, and plenty of room obviously to add more storage as you go. So let's get to the build. Let me show you the price first, because that's probably what's on your mind. How do I calculate the price? Let me bring that over. So here's the price. Here's how I calculate the price. A lot of times you see on the internet the build. They say $600 build, $700 build. Well, this build technically, yes, is a 700-ish, if not less than, build. However, I like to be honest as I can for expectations. There's always tax with that, usually. I mean, depending on where you buy it from. And then if I do the build for people that need me to help them out, I usually ask for compensation. So when I say this is an $835 to $837 build, it's because this is how I price it out. But you can see the prices of all these. These were at the time I bought it. Usually the Ryzen 3 3100 is cheaper than this, yes. But in this case, I couldn't find it anywhere, not even on Amazon. Everything was up price, so I found it on B&H for $126, and that's what I went with. And I am not upset about it at all. It's a fantastic chip. So that's the build. It's designed as a budget build, 100 tops FPS, but still good, smooth experience where you can actually stream, record video if you want to record your gameplay and not break the bank. So let's get to the build video and also some benchmarks at the end. For this build, we're going to start right with the motherboard. And what you can see on the motherboard is you have your RAM slots right here that I've already installed. Right here on the RAM, the little white description down here, it tells you what slots to put them in. Sometimes that's in the motherboard, but essentially what I'm doing is I'm putting the RAM slots in the position that's going to be able to guide the RAM to the memory channels on the computer chip. And that's how they're arranged, and the motherboard will make sure you know how to do that. And your RAM, again, is 3200 megahertz, and we're doing 16 gigs. Now, right here underneath this heatsink right here is actually your M.2 drive. Let me go in. You'll be able to see. Let's see if we can kind of get see if you can see the drive in there. The M.2 drive is just a 500 gigabyte solid drive on an M.2 NVMe slot, PCIe slot, and it's the fastest drive out there that's available. Now yours is 2400 read and write speeds, which is actually a very good speed for any computer, really. Obviously, it's not the fastest, it's not the slowest, but it's definitely going to do the job for gaming. Now, for the computer chip that you see in the middle there, that's the brain of the board. It's actually very easy to install. Essentially, you lift up the arm, and then you push the arm down once you put it in place. And there is a triangle, this gold triangle right there on the bottom left-hand side of the chip that aligns with the triangle on the motherboard that tells you kind of how to align that, and it just drops right on in there, and you close that. the ARM. Now your motherboard, just to kind of give you background, the way it's designed is that up here is a heat sink to control what they call the VRM, which is controlling the voltages from the power supply to the chip to all the components in the motherboard, really, to make sure it's going well. Right here, this heat sink's actually over the actual chip, the B550 chip that's running the motherboard, that's kind of dictating how it works. And of course, you have all the slots to put your power. Another one up here. Yep. And on the side, you have all your input outputs. We'll discuss that later. But now the motherboard's basically put together. The only last thing I need to do is to pop the cooler right on top of the computer chip. And you'll notice that there's this thing called a thermal pad on the bottom of the cooler. It's basically a paste of sorts that's going to stick to the chip to make sure that it can bring in the heat to the metal of this cooler, and then obviously the fan's going to spin it cool to keep your computer chip cool. We're going to keep the stock cooler because if you're using a Ryzen 3 3100 chip, most likely you're not going to be doing any crazy overclocking. You're going to just use it as it is, which is what it's designed to do. So we are ready to go. We're going to put the cooler on, and we're going to move over to the case. To talk about the case, I'll describe the fans at the end once we get the fans all completed. But the case, essentially, the motherboard is going to go right here in this location, and it's going to plop right on down. Now, what I've already installed on the left side here is what we call the input-output shield, or I/O shield. And you can see it's just a nice plate of where your USB ports are going to go, your audio ports are going to go, and that's pre-installed. I put that in before I put the motherboard in because the input-outputs of the motherboard, which are right here, your Ethernet, right, your Ethernet, your USBs, your Wi-Fi, your audio, are going to line up right with that shield. Now, to describe how I'm going to plop this in here, what I'm going to do is there's these standoffs all around the cage. And down here at the bottom, it's actually telling me how I need to put those standoffs for the kind of motherboard we're using. Now, your motherboard is a micro ATX motherboard. You can easily figure that out, by the way. When you buy another motherboard, it's going to let you know what type it is. But it's just basically the medium-sized motherboard. And so I basically went ahead and found all the M locations and put the standoffs in those. So you can see that's all I did. So I'm going to plop this motherboard down, screw it on nice and tight so it's settled inside the chassis. And then we'll work with the power supply and make sure everything's plugged in so we can actually get this thing turned on soon. Okay, so here you've seen that I was able to get all the cables connected. And let me explain. So obviously I have all these screws screwed in tight so that the motherboard is now tight to the board. You can see it's aligned to the I/O shield. And I've gotten the fan plugged into the main fan header, just a CPU fan at the top. I have the 8-pin CPU power connector connected to the top left corner. It's very obvious which one it is. It actually says CPU on the bottom of it. I have the 24-pin power connected right here. That's an easy one to find as well. There's only one like it. And then down here I have the USB connector for your front panel. Let me just show you this real quick. On the back of your case, you have these front panel connectors right here, and they correspond with these right here. You have your power button, your reset button, and your 2 USB ports, and a audio jack. So what I've done is I've taken all these cords and I've cabled them back into the front, and let me just show you where I've put them all. This is actually very easy to do because there's only one way to do it. You can't mess this up, otherwise it won't work. But you have a very easy guide right here telling you how to connect the front power and your reset switch and your lighting, etc. It's right here telling you exactly how to put it in. And so I just plugged them into the right location. Over here is your audio for the front audio, and it just tells you exactly where to plug it in. And right here is your USB port. Now you have 2 USBs, which is why you see 2 cords here for the 2 USB ports on the top. So that is your case. Everything's now connected and ready to go. And now what I need to do is I need to install the fans, and we'll explain the fans in a moment. Okay, I just finished going through installing your fans, and let me just explain the fan configuration. And the easiest way to know how the fans intake or outtake air, the fan where the fins are closest to your hand, such as this, is where it's indicating that it's taking in air, and such as over here where the fins are actually hidden behind some sort of shield, that's the outtake of air. So I know that these sides over here are coming in, and this one over here is going out, and that's how I've arranged it. Because your computer chip's here, I want to have these 2 fans to suck that air out of the machine. So you have the outtake on the back of the case over here, and then of course up here at the top. Now over here on these 3 side fans, of course your front panel, which is sitting right over here, is going to cover this. But these 3 side fans are going to be sucking in air to keep everything on the inside cool. Because remember, we're going to have the graphics card sitting right here in a moment, and we need to make sure that everything is kept cool. Now let me show you how I manage all this on the back. Before I do so, you see these cables? These lighted cables are actually part of your fans that you purchased, and it's actually going to be part of your RGB. I find this to be a very economical way to add RGB to your build by just using the fans. Let me show you the back real quick. The back of the computer is where you're going to be doing a lot of your cable management. So you can see, for instance, all these front panel headers that I have. I'm kind of tying them down to keep them out of the way, etc. But let me talk about the fans. So this portal here is what's controlling your RGB fans. That comes with a controller, and we're going to go through this later. But the controller is basically going to control the speed, the color, everything about the fan, so that whoever's using the computer can have a lot more user-friendly, a more enjoyable experience controlling the customization of their build. Now, I have all the cords from the fans coming through here and attaching into this, except for the bottom one, which you can see is a more basic fan that came with the unit. And that's actually connected via a true fan header that could go on the motherboard, but it's too short to reach. So the case came included with this little old school connector that we basically connected to an obvious connector in the power supply. It's plugged in there, and now it's going to be able to get power from that. And so this little power connector that you're not going to use at all, I'm going to just shove inside the case. Now what's powering this, however, is a SATA port connection, such as this, that you're going to use for your hard drives, your SSDs. So what I did is I went ahead and connected it here, and these bunch of SATA connecting ports that you're not going to use immediately, I'm also going to shove into the case out of the way, because you're most likely not going to need those immediately. If you do need to add more hard drive space and stuff like that by using these SATA connectors, you're going to have a lot of them ready for you that you can shove into the hard drives you put here, the solid state drives you put here, or the solid state drives you put on the front. So right now the fans are completed, everything's done, and now it's time to move on to the graphics card after I put the front panel back on the front, which is just a snap-in. Okay, the time has come to now put in your 1650 Super. This is a good looking card. You can tell it's thick enough to handle some good heat sinks to keep it cool. How this is going to work is we're going to put this in this silver PCIe slot, and I've opened the side of your case over here so that the outputs that you see here will be able to protrude from outside the case. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this slot here. I'm going to literally just push it right in, and it's going to protrude from the outside, and your card is going to be installed. And the only thing I have to do is when I turn the computer on to make sure I download the drivers. And as you can see, we have this in. We have it plugged in with the power from it's a PCIe power connector. You know, you have two slots in case you need to add additional cards in the future, which you probably won't, but that is there for you. You can see over here we've locked this in, so it's now nice and tidy on this side. And your computer is essentially made. Now we got to basically just plug it in, put it into a monitor, and we should boot it up. Okay, now it's time for the moment of truth. I have it all plugged in. I have it all turned on. I have my HDMI connected to this monitor. I'm going to, for the first time, press the power button on the top, and let's hope it boots up. And it does. It is looking good. Now the fans are spinning pretty high. We'll have to figure out what that's all about. That's okay. Okay, they just went to normal. That's fine. And look at this. So the lighting is looking good. Okay, you can see that it's actually working. I have Ryzen 3 3100 4-core processor. It's recognizing 2600 or so DDR speeds. Yours is actually set at 32, so we'll fix that later. But I'm going to go ahead and plug in the keyboard, and we're going to go ahead and go into the BIOS. I'm going to press F1 to get to the BIOS. We are now in the BIOS, and it is working. You can see up here your CPU speed, 3.6 gigahertz. That's very good. If it has today's date on it, well, that's pretty... It's off. I got to fix that. I'll make when I connect to the internet. Oh, it's because it's probably on a different time zone. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just really quickly go to memory down here. You have better memory than what's showing. You can see down here it's actually being able to pull 3200 megahertz of memory. And so all I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the top of the BIOS, go to XMP Profile 1, and I'm going to X out of it and say save. And when I restarted, it went ahead and made it to 3200 megahertz. That's really all you need to do in the BIOS. I'm also going to do a couple of checks. I'm going to check to make sure that your BIOS is up to date in a little bit. But before I do that, let's just go ahead and install Windows. And that's by this USB here. I have Windows installation media on here. I'm going to simply put it into a USB port on your computer and run it. And that's going to install Windows. And once that's installed, I'm going to get all the drivers installed, and I'm going to do a couple benchmarks. But this computer should be good to go. Okay, so everything's pretty much done. I just want to show you where I went to download the drivers. If you go to the MSI B550M Pro VDH website, which is the motherboard you have. You can see in the top left. You simply have to go to support, and when you get to support, you come down here to the BIOS to download the most recent BIOS. I'm going to go ahead and use that BIOS. I'm going to install it, and I will go ahead and install the most recent BIOS later on the motherboard, so I have that downloaded on my USB. And then the drivers is what I've just installed. I went ahead and went to Windows 10 64, and I downloaded, I didn't need the RAID drivers because you're not going to be using RAID, but I went ahead and got the chipset drivers, the LAN drivers for Bluetooth, Intel, and your Ethernet, and then your audio drivers. So all these are now installed. I've got them all done, and that's just where I went to get them. So now I'm going to run the Windows updates one more time, just to make sure that everything is good to go. And I will check for updates, and I think it should say I'm good. And if I'm good, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and install a game. Okay, still download. So anyway, I'm going to keep downloading these updates, and while I'm at it, I'm going to download maybe Modern Warfare in the background to just check a really high graphics intensive game to make sure it's working, and we'll call it good. Yes, one very important thing I forgot, your graphics card that's sitting over there. I got to get the drivers for that, even though it's working fine. I want to make sure you have the most recent drivers so that the gaming experience is best. I went to GeForce Experience. I'm going to download this software, and essentially it's going to be able to run in your background. It's something that whoever's gaming can use to screenshot things and to stream and to record their games as they go. So I'm going to get that installed and install the latest drivers for that. But you should be good to go after that, and once that's done, I will go ahead and run a graphics card benchmark with a software that I have to make sure that everything's running smoothly. Alright, as you can see, I have this downloaded. It says game driver ready, and I'm going to go ahead and download the most recent that was released on the 7th of October. Now what's nice about this is that it recognizes, if I go home, I think it's under settings, it recognizes up here the card I'm using. So that's good. This software is designed to basically set everything up for me. It's downloading the most recent software, and once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and run a benchmark, make sure it's good to go, and then I'll go ahead and update the BIOS. For this next part, we're going to do a benchmark with the graphics card. Everything's been installed, all the drivers for the graphics card and everything. So we're going to do Extreme HD, and we're going to run this as a benchmark. It's called the Benchmark Valley. It's just a nice thing by Unigen Corp. I'm going to run a benchmark, and we're going to see what the score is at the end. We're going to compare it to other scores that use similar setups to ours. And there is the final results of this using a 4-core processor, the Ryzen 3 3100. We get an average of 57.1 on Extra Ultra HD for a score of 2390. And, compared online, that is lower than most things I've seen online, simply because when people do online benchmarks like this, they're using a much higher quality CPU processor. But if you look in the background, let me just run this one last time. It's a very clean picture, and I'm going to play some games on it in a moment. But if you just kind of watch it, you'll see that it's a very clean, crisp picture. It's running very well, and gaming on this would be a really, really good experience. All right, so before I game, I'm going to just quickly update the BIOS. And the way you do that is you go into the BIOS when you restart it, just keep pressing the delete key until the BIOS opens. I'm going to go to M-Flash, that's where the BIOS is, and I'm going to say, yes, I'm going to enter BIOS mode. When you get into the BIOS mode, it's going to tell you down here at the bottom what the current BIOS is, and this was actually done in June of 2020, and I'm going to go up to where it's recognizing my USB where I put the BIOS. I basically downloaded the BIOS, unzipped the folder, and it's sitting there waiting for me, and I'm going to tell it where to go. I know that it's in this folder, and it's this BIOS right here. And I'm going to click on it, and it's going to say, okay, so this is the BIOS I want to update. And down here, it's going to tell me, here's the selected BIOS. It's this version on this build date. Am I sure I want to update to that BIOS? And I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to just sit here and wait, and it's going to update the BIOS. All right, so the BIOS just completed, and the computer is slowly turning back on here. The BIOS probably took about 10-15 minutes, to be honest. Let's just see how it goes when we turn it back on. Okay, you're back in the BIOS. You can see up here it says 2.241 right there. That's the one we needed on the 29th of September. And again, we're going to go back to our XMP profile 1, which is the 3200 megahertz memory. And we're going to save this, and we should be good to go. All right, let's just do one last check. Our CPU, Ryzen 3 3100, 4-core processor, 4 cores, 8 threads. Let's go to our memory. running 32 megahertz of 16 gigabytes of RAM. You can see up here 16 gigabytes at 3200 megahertz speed. So I'm pretty happy about this. I'm going to play a game real quick to see how it runs, but this is looking really good. All right, so I did play a game. This is a heavier graphic game on medium to high settings, and you can see in the top left corner that I recorded it as well on the graphics card. You could see that I was averaging, and I'm just skipping through the game, close to 80 to 90 frames a second. So I didn't get above that. I didn't get above 100, which is really, over 100 is great, but I was playing very smooth on these settings, and I'm happy to keep it. So that's how good I was able to play on this, and of course on lower settings game, lower graphic game, it's going to be a really good experience. Fortnite's going to be a good experience. Rocket League, things like that's going to be a great experience. So I'm really happy with this, really pleased, and I think this is going to be a smooth game experience.